Hi, this is Hugh Cushing from WhiteSource, and I'm here to show you how to set up and use the WhiteSource to Fortify application vulnerability management integration. The point to this integration is to allow you to feed WhiteSource findings into Fortify Software Security Center. Use case there is that you're using Software Security Center as the central collection point for all things application security, whether it's findings from WhiteSource or from a SaaS tool or a DAS tool or manual findings, code reviews, those sorts of things. Our automation, our integration can feed our findings into Software Security Center automatically. So there are three components that you need to set this integration up. There are two jar files, and for WhiteSource customers, you can get those from WhiteSource support. Right? There's the main agent, which is the thing that does the synchronization. And then there's a Fortify parser plugin, which has to go into, be installed into Software Security Center, as I'll show you, to parse the data and map it that's coming from WhiteSource. And then the third thing you need is a configuration file. It's called WhiteSource AVM Agent Config. You could probably also get a sample of that from support. If you aren't able to do it that way, or you want it ahead of time, go to this chapter in our documentation, and you'll find a link about halfway down to search for the file name, and it'll allow you to download a sample one. And so those are the three components you need. And the config file looks like this. So to set it up, the first thing you do is to go to Software Security Center and install that parser. And you have to be an admin in Software Security Center. It's the easiest thing to do. There are users with the right permissions that could do it, but being an admin level is the easiest. You go to the Administration tab, you pick Plugins down here, and then you pick Parsers down here. You click New, saying Micro Focus doesn't guarantee how well this thing works. And you choose the smaller of the two jar files, the one with the one called WSS Fortify Parser plugin. Say start the upload. It begins there. By default, when you load in one of these parser plugins, it's disabled. So you simply click here to get the details of the plugin, and you just click enable. Again, click through the legalese, and that's what you need to do on that end. Then the other part, the heavy lifting, is done by the other jar file. That jar file can reside on any machine that can both communicate with WhiteSource, whether that's SAS.whitesourcesoftware.com or your own dedicated instance, or maybe your own on-premise version, communicate with, more specifically, with its API endpoints, and that machine should also be able to communicate with Software Security Center. Okay, so in my case, I just have it running locally here. All right, so I have. I'll go back to this command. Basically, when I want the sync to run, I just run this jar file, Java jar, and then this jar name. But there's a little bit you have to do ahead of time before it'll work, obviously. First thing you have to do is tell this integration via WhiteSource which projects and products you want to sync with Software Security Center. And you do that by using WhiteSource product and project tags. Okay. So to come back here, I'm going to go to a project that I already integrated with Software Security Center. Here's the project. And if I go into its properties, you'll see I've created two tags. Right? AVM application name and AVM.application.version. These are case sensitive, so be sure you type them exactly that way. So let's go to a new project. And I'm going to create those two tags. Actually, I already did for you, but we haven't yet run the integration yet. So you'll see I've created avm.application.name key with a value of face swap. I just happened to name it the same as what it's named in WhiteSource, but you could map it to some different name in SSC if you wanted. And then I mapped the version. Said the version should map to version 1.0 in Software Security Center. Just so you know, if you're not familiar with it, if you take a look at applications in Fortify Software Security Center, there's the application name here, and then under that, there's going to be one or more versions. Right? So here you'll see I've mapped, I'm going to map this face swap to a version 1.0. And you'll notice, by the way, here, if I'm listing all the applications, and face swap is not one of them. Now, what I'm going to do here is use the sync feature of the Fortify integration, which, if you turn that on, will create projects in Software Security Center if they don't exist already. We'll show you about that when we look at the configuration file. So the first thing you got to do is, either at the project or the product level, do this kind of mapping. Okay. You can also set up wildcards if you want, and that's shown how to do in the Fortify integration documentation. I won't go into that here. So that's the first thing you need to do. The second thing you need to do is set up the config file for the agent, integration agent that's going to run. The config file looks like this. Okay? There's a few things that you have to provide that you would expect. First of all, how is this integration going to get to WhiteSource? Which WhiteSources should it get to? Well, in this case, we're going to AWS Cloud version in the US. And then it needs an API key and a user key. Right? It could be anybody's user key that has privileges to get to the projects that we need to work with. Right? There are other options. You can limit the scope. You can limit which dates of projects changes we limit it to. There are some options to generate an offline report for those of you who are on-premise users that are air-gapped. There's also this option called force sync. I would recommend leaving this to true, setting this to true at first, so that everything gets created at once and there's no surprises about, well, something didn't get synced because it was not considered to have a significant change. So, at least initially, I'd recommend leaving that on. There's some log level options you can set. And then this is an interesting one, the Synchronize From option. This Synchronize From option will say what happens if a WhiteSource alert is ignored or unignored. Or on the other side, what happens if a Software Security Center vulnerability is suppressed or unsuppressed. Okay, just to familiarize you with that, if you're not familiar with it, when you go to a project and you take a look at the alerts, you can at any time, if you have the privilege, go in here and say, ignore this alert. Okay. Now, separately in Software Security Center, you have the ability to go into a project, take a look at a vulnerability, and again, if you have privileges, you can suppress a find. Okay. Now, the feature here in our WhiteSource Fortify integration allows it so that if you want to, then when a WhiteSource alert is ignored, it will automatically then suppress the corresponding alert in Fortify Software Security Center. Right? Now, what this parameter is about is just which way does it work, which one has precedence. Okay, so if it says synchronize from equals WS, it means it's WhiteSource's alerts status that are going to drive the status of Software Security Center. So as you flip an alert from ignored to unignored, that'll flip the corresponding Software Security Center entry back from suppressed to unsuppressed. If you made this value AVM, short for Application Vulnerability Management System, then it would work the other way. As you suppress a value, a finding in Software Security Center, then it would go back and ignore the corresponding alert in WhiteSource. For our purposes, we're going to leave it for WS. We also need some details, of course, about where Fortify is, where the AVM is. In this case, the first thing you need to say is which flavor of the AVM integration is this, and you have to write the word Fortify, just like this, for the value of the AVM name parameter. You then just have to give it the URL to get to Software Security Center, and the first time you come in, you have to supply a user and a password. You'll see later on, that's a one-time deal. Once you've done that, the integration will then automatically obtain an API key, a Software Security Center API key, and put it in this file automatically, so that then you can eliminate, you can delete the username and password from this config file. And the rest of these settings are either have to do with the thread fix flavor or aren't very interesting, with one exception. This last one is interesting. AVM application sync equals true. If that's set to true, what that means is it's going to, as I mentioned, create new applications and versions in Software Security Center if they don't exist already, as new tagged WhiteSource products and projects are created. So you'll see here, specifically, that brings us back to our example, in WhiteSource, right here, I have a project called Face Swap. But in Software Security Center, I don't have an application called Face Swap. Right? So you'll see when we run the sync, it's going to create it for us. Right? Then it's just a matter of running the plugin. Now, this file here has to be in the same directory by default as the jar, the AVM agent main jar. You can actually specify a -C to point it to somewhere else, but right now you'll see that it exists in that directory. That file is there, and so now if we run our integration here, it's going to pick up the settings from that config file that we just set and do its thing. So the first thing it does is display the values from the config file. Then it's going to grab a login token that you can reuse going forward. Got that by logging in with the username and password. It then checks for applications that need to be mapped, creates those vulnerabilities, creates the project in this case, and then creates all the vulnerabilities into the AVM object. And then finally synchronizing alerts status, meaning is something ignored or not. It says, in this case, it says synchronizing alert status from WhiteSource to AVM. That's because we set the synchronize from parameter to be equal to WS right here. And it's done. So now if we go back to Software Security Center, we do a little refresh, sure enough, there's a third application there, third version, and a version of that application. Remember, those names came from these tags that we gave it. So we've got Face Swap version 1.0 created by us through the integration. and there's a whole bunch of issues. Okay. Now, to show how the synchronization of ignoring works, let's go back here to WhiteSource, and we're going to take this one particular finding here for CVE 2021-41196, and we're going to ignore it on the WhiteSource side. And then we're going to run our integration again. So in this case, nothing else will have changed, but the status of the alert, in this case, the fact that it's being ignored, it has changed on the WhiteSource side. We've told it to synchronize from the WhiteSource side to the Fortify side, and so you'll see once it runs through the update, you'll see it says synchronizing alert status from WhiteSource to AVM, setting one issues as suppressed. And when then that's done, we'll come back to Software Security Center, and sure enough, that issue has been suppressed. 41196. That little S means suppressed. The only reason we're seeing it here is because in Software Security Center, for demonstration purposes, I have show suppressed issues turned on. If I turn that off, you'll see the issue doesn't show up at all. So that's how you can keep the status in sync from WhiteSource to Software Security Center. And of course, if I unignored it on this end, it would unsuppress it on that end after the next sync. Okay, that's the quick introduction to the Fortify integration and how it works. Two last things to mention. One is, once you've run the integration once, you will then see a new couple of lines at the end of your config file that the integration automatically adds, and it's an API key. It's got an expiration on it. I think the default token expiration length is up to Fortify, but once you run the integration once with a username and password specified elsewhere, then it will supply an API key that can be used going forward, and then you can delete the username and password from your config file for security purposes. The other thing to mention is that you can run this jar manually as you'd like, but if you'd like it to be a truly automated integration, of course, you're going to have to schedule a run of this Java jar every so often, every couple hours, or whatever the right cadence is for you, using your favorite schedulers such as cron or at or whatever you choose to use, so that this integration becomes self-sustaining and low maintenance. Great, thanks very much.